I think cloning has been hidden from us, and here's why. If anything, we have learned that there have been numerous things suppressed related to the misery and suffering of humanity, but also the greed and the imagination and the cover-ups of humanity. We've learned about propaganda campaigns, how to manipulate people's minds, how to discredit entire lines of reasoning, and to poke holes in people's reputation so it causes enough doubt and scrutiny that even if it was logically possible, there's almost this barrier that is put up and resistance to even conceiving that that is true. We've also learned that there have been key technologies and breakthroughs in physics, this is Dr. Greer's work, that have been buried underground, and others related to free energy, where people try to invent devices and then they just end up dead somewhere, time and time and time again. And whistleblowers that try to come out about very unique propulsion, eliminating groundbreaking technological feats that would revolutionize everything, literally, in numerous beneficial ways, and the way that we interact in the world and perceive ourselves in it. We would be catapulted into the future almost instantaneously if some of these technologies were to make its way into the consumer sector and mainstream, and yet when whistleblowers try to come out about it, they find themselves floating down rivers. I recently heard of something called the Ebner effect, where organisms like seeds of crops and fish eggs respond differentially to the electrostatic field, wherein you could manipulate said field and watch how the organisms actually seem to access different epigenetic or parts of their DNA. Like there's something about the field that changes the way that the DNA is expressed. And the authors of this, accordingly, you want to do your own research, of course. I've only just now caught some secondary sources, so I'm not an authority, but the authors of this were apparently very excited and published and invented something pertaining to this and indicated that you would need less agrochemicals, that you could actually use fewer pesticides and herbicides. And it was revolutionary. It was amazing. And they spontaneously, after everything was patented, ended up dying. At least that's the rumor. When you ask ChatGPT, ChatGPT says that we can't really locate them. And we don't know really if they're dead, if they're alive, and they've been discredited by mainstream science, and so they're not seen as credible, and the science never moved forward. Much like some of Dr. Greer's exposés of the innovations in physics that suddenly were taken to the underground basements of our society, working in secret in the black budget projects, but never really making it to the light of day. Meanwhile, graduate students like me back in the lab are moving things forward. I wasn't a physicist, but I was a neuroscientist, and none the wiser, not understanding that there have been crazy advances in medicine and physics and other sciences that would shock most world-renowned, best of the best scientists in the mainstream. And of course, we have these rumors on social media, eye roll rumors of people like Kanye coming out after a long pause from the world, and his stature and frame looks different. Perhaps it's him, perhaps it's not. He gave a warning before he disappeared and said, look, if they disappear me, you know that they got me. Well, he disappeared for a while and came back and was suddenly towing the party line for a little bit before he went off the rails again. There's a lot of mystery surrounding him and others who report that there are technologies and there are pressures to uphold certain people's truths. And if you don't obey, then your memories are wiped in a clinic. Or you are forced hospitalized and given medication and may or may not be tested on. For what? It's not really clear. Your compliance, your clonability, nobody really knows. So there are many people on social media that will compare photos and say, this is not the same person. They've done it with notable celebrities and even Biden at some point. Now, there is such a thing as putting on masks and putting on shows and body doubles and stand-ins and things of this nature. So it really convolutes the possibility of the conversations we could be having, because we can all dismiss it and say, okay, it's clearly not the same person, but it's their stand-in. It's their whatever it is. Until you start listening to some of the people in those positions make jokes about having clones or wanting to talk about cloning, but it's on late night TV and everybody's laughing. And was it serious? Was it real? Nobody really knows. So we're all just going to smile and forget that it was ever said. But we would know by now. They haven't cloned anything aside from Dolly, the sheep. And that was a long time ago. That's most people's perception, because things like this are not reported on and constructively talked about. So a lot of people think that that's where we've left off. I remember being in graduate school and having serious conversations with other scientists about cloning and cloning technology. And that was just working on stem cells. Because I went to a Catholically aligned university, it was forbidden and it wasn't something that we could do, but we talked about the ethics of it. And even we thought that the cloning technologies, while they existed somewhere out in the ether, it wasn't really a thing, not the way that a human could be cloned in a lab. Yes, you can clone cells and you can clone tissue and things of that sort. And people were doing that in certain universities, but cloning animals and cloning people was just so far out of the realm of what we even thought was possible. So as we're sitting around tables talking about the ethics of cloning from stem cells and creating tissue that would help to heal people, we had no idea about what was really out there, apparently. It's kind of funny when you think back, at least when I'm accessing those memories. I'm in this room and somebody's giving a presentation and the lights are dim, so it's just the digital projector, and we're lit up by the PowerPoint colors and slides, and having this small talk, but serious talk amongst what would be very serious scientists. I mean, we were baby scientists then. We were going to go out into the world and do something in science, and it was going to be very important. We were like the future minds of science, all completely unaware and oblivious that we didn't really understand science the way that we thought we did. We understood a whitewashed version of science, the mainstream version of science that was iterative and slow, and you had to apply for grants, and it has to be disease related, and you had to follow this peer review process, and it could be arduous and time consuming and fraught with rejection after rejection. And so you had to be very strategic about your career and who you worked with and the projects that you did, all to make these little tiny jumps. These iterative piggybacks is really what it is. You had to create on top of what somebody else had already created. And so relative to what I would end up finding out about the cloning world, we were very, very behind in our understanding. And this was not a slacker school. This was, I misquoted it recently in an episode. I thought that it was a top 10 when I went, but it was in the top 15. My apologies if you've been following along. Sometimes I'll make mistakes like that, and then I realize it after and I'll feel embarrassed. But it was the top 15, and it was a very, very rigorous program. Extremely rigorous. And even we did not have the full picture of what was capable in the life sciences industry. Much like we also wouldn't understand about the patents of human biology that had been done decades before we even entered school, before some of us were even born. People had made major strides in understanding in how our energy field could interact with EMF activity and how certain manipulations could actually create sensory experiences and perceptual experiences for others. You can literally manipulate a human being's nervous system to make them sleepy, to make them more aroused, to give them heart attacks. That was weaponized. To implant voices in their mind so they think that they're talking to God. These are all published, verifiable, well understood technologies that now are out there in the mainstream for you to research yourself if you're so inclined. But I don't recommend it because some of the stuff can actually get to you a little bit when you understand how it might be used under certain regimes. But of course, we, as budding neuroscientists at that time, thought that the primary way to manipulate somebody's brain and perceptual experience was cutting them open and implanting them, as trying to do a deep brain stimulation, such as in Parkinson's disease, or putting a cap over their head and magnetizing their skull and putting them in an MRI machine, all very clunky devices which are not very stealthy at all. The thought of remotely accessing somebody's nervous system from miles away using satellites or lasers or devices or radio waves was completely not discussed in my program. Much less utilizing some of these techniques for warfare or for coercion, or for getting people to submit to your demands because they were none the wiser, because you could infiltrate the very thoughts. Their body, you can remotely deliver pain, temperature changes, you can make somebody sexually aroused. For God's sake, why would you need to do that? And how on earth would that be paired with any sort of conditioning techniques to create sexual deviancy and addiction? But I digress. So my point to you is that in the mainstream, there can be a huge disparity in what is actually possible, what is known to be possible, and what is thought to be possible. And there are multiple examples, distally and personal to me, to illustrate just how powerful this effect is. That when you control the narrative and you control what we believe is possible, then even a top neuroscience program will be wasting time and energy talking about and iterating science in such a way that is lagging behind what is actually being done. And nobody will be none the wiser. And the takeaway that I had then in graduate school was that cloning was very tightly regulated. And it was something that you couldn't just do even if you wanted to. There were things, regulation and permissions, and it was locked down. That's the best way to describe it. But because I haven't participated in that, that's just the impression that I had in our conversations. And of course, My impressions may have been colored by the fact that I was at the oldest Catholic university in the United States, Georgetown, and this was a topic that was forbidden. Cloning was just absolutely forbidden. Obviously, for religious and ethical reasons. So imagine my surprise, fast forwarding years into the future, and I'm watching an interview with Elon Musk, talking to somebody, I can't remember. And he was saying that there was a dog cloning company, I believe it was in Austin, and that if you could clone a dog, that you weren't that far away from a human. My mind was blown because I didn't even know that that existed, but I had been off the map for a while doing a spiritual awakening and traveling around interdimensionally. And so there's a lot of things that I have to catch up on. And as I shift into new realities, sometimes it seems like I'm supposed to know things that I don't. And that's been fun. But so I started looking into it. And indeed, I found the company that he was referring to. And then I found something else. In 1997, there was a company, or more specifically, a project that was created called Clone Aid. CLONEAID. And this was a company that was established in the Bahamas, even though it appears to be created by founders that are not native to the Bahamas. And apparently, the company started as a human cloning company, which garnered a lot of media attention. And by the year 2002, they reported to the world that using their technology, they created a baby girl named Eve to a infertile American couple. This apparently was, in some places, a media storm, and there's a lot of hand-waving and controversy behind it. I don't really have the full story, but what I find interesting is that they are completely debunked online. So when you go to the Wikipedia page, it's like they're crazy UFO people and they're a cult, and the bishop of this cult wanted to clone humans, and there is no scientific evidence. This is just absolutely not real, and absolutely no, and definitely not. Which, if we've learned anything from the hand of propagandists, then we know that whenever there is any sort of pressure to see things in a certain way, like discrediting somebody, saying that they're crazy, that they're part of a UFO cult, and UFOs are just absolutely insane. People are tinfoil hat people, and I roll. Except now we know that there have been decades-long cover-ups and abuses related to said technology and more. And so we also know that there are entire disinformation campaigns. Literally, people were hired to go out and infiltrate the spectacle of mass media to create confusion and disorientation around topics, and to create this perception that if you aligned with somebody in the UFO culture, that you were essentially a mad hatter. You were a crazy person. So if you had any credibility and any semblance of a reputation that you wanted to keep intact, then identifying yourself as a fringe UFO follower was a surefire way to shoot yourself in the foot. So obviously, when I see this on the Wikipedia entry that, oh, it's just a bunch of crazy people, the UFO people, they could be, they could not be. I'm less concerned about their spiritual and religious beliefs. Personally, I just want to know, do they actually have cloning technology? And does it work? According to them, it does. And Eve had to go into hiding. According to the fact checkers, which are definitely not manipulated in any way to sway anybody's opinion whatsoever, it's just not true and never has been true. But here's what I find intriguing is that over the last couple of years, I've checked in on their webpage and it's still active, it's still alive, but it looks like it's from when they set up the company, to be honest. And when you look down at the copyright at the very bottom of the screen, it says that the page was last updated in 2009. Okay. But checking the Whois database entry shows that their domain is still registered and active to them, obviously, since the webpage is still up. And it's being presumably updated every year, a couple years. I don't know when their lease is up. It's up again next year. But somebody is still funding and maintaining the site. And the site is still active and shrouded in a little bit of mystery. It's like, just so you know, Clone Aid is the project name. Hint, hint, not the company name, because for obvious reasons, we need to protect our privacy. And if you're interested in our services, you can fill out an email form. I haven't tested the email form. I'm not trying to get that close to them, but they are still open for business. For a company that apparently is completely debunked. And how long can a company that is completely debunked and has no media support, no credibility, nothing like that, trashed in the public eye, hidden and buried, how long can a company like that, do you think, stay alive? Because we're going on 30 years. Remember, I said that it was started in 1997. I know I actually work with entrepreneurs that struggle to make it past year 5. And they have technology that works and doesn't work, but works. In fact, most companies don't last 20 years if they have technology that is completely defunct and broken and no media credibility whatsoever, completely underground. Nobody's really heard of them. Some people might remember the spectacle that was debunked later. It was a hoax. It definitely was a hoax, wasn't it? And usually tech companies that do go the long haul, that aren't actually making money, that are trying to develop something, have enormous funding, enormous investment that, based on the media report and the webpage, looks like no investor, legitimate investor, would touch it with a 10-foot pole. Meanwhile, back at the lab, there are graduate students around the world that believes that cloning is one thing, when in reality, it might be something entirely different and much more progressive and advanced than we're led to believe. Because when stories and information and public perception is controlled, we create the story in our mind and our expectations and behave accordingly. And when that story is given to us and repeated time and time again, then we are the ones that are left in the dark, not understanding what's going on. Meanwhile, we see these rumors on social media where people have been replaced, they were acting up, put the bad children in the tube, and you have people like me that have an after-death experience or a near-death experience, depending on where you're listening and your framework for these things. Binary societies usually believe in 0 and 1. You can either be alive or dead. You cannot be both. That's not possible. And so, depending on your frame of reference, take this for what it's worth. after I felt the cold blade on my neck and left my body during a time of intense duress where my apartment was being broken into and my space was being violated. I had a very unusual series of experiences that I talk about here and there, but I've deleted a lot of episodes for good reason. It's a bit heavy. And during this experience, I was in a very peaceful place, resting on a mound, kind of like in a different world, not an earthly plane of existence at all. It was more like, the best way to describe it is like a fairy-esque world, but not like a fairy tale. It was different, dreamlike world where the materialization of things was different. It was not at all like a human form and a human life. And I was sleeping on a mound when the hand of God came to me and woke me up and said, "You're going back. And tell them I'm angry about the clones." And then I was transported, my consciousness was back to my body, back to my place in Dallas. These are all perceptual experiences. I don't know if I can literally say that this is exactly what happened from an outside observer's perspective, but this is what I experienced. And I would then undergo a series of radical sensory and perceptual experiences that I would read about in the book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, where they talk about what dying feels like. Yeah. I separately, independently went through that without understanding what was happening. And I didn't know how to talk about it or categorize it for a really long time until I found this book and read this book. And then things started to not quite make sense, but give me a better understanding of how I could talk about it a little bit. But there's still a lot that is challenging. But I came back to life. I came back to the world. And lots of things were different and challenging. And it was like I was entering into a different dimension. But my friends and my family didn't perceive that I had died. They perceived that I just ran off to the other side of the world. And I didn't tell them what was going on because I couldn't talk about what was going on because I didn't know how to talk about it. They were very angry with me for a long time because they felt hurt by it. And even though I told them it had nothing to do with them and everything to do with something I wasn't prepared to talk about, they were still quite, they felt abandoned. And some people in my family took it very personally that I couldn't tell them what was going on. And one person in particular, this really hurt because they were the closest person, confidant that I had. And they took it so personally, it fractured our friendship because they couldn't see past their own abandonment wounds. So it gave me a profound understanding of the projections that we have and how we interrupt intimacy and holding space for other people's experience and the cadence and the time that they want to share and giving them alone time to process, to be able to integrate these things is something that I believe is important for any healthy relationship. But before that experience, I was threatened by people doing that and needing that level of autonomy. And so as a result, I learned how valuable it was because when I was given that same treatment of being crucified for needing space and time to work through some personal obstacles, it helped me to understand how I had acted unfairly to people in my life in the past. I think that's what karma is about. Somebody needed to hear that. I'm not sure who, but back to cloning. So, similar to the advances that have been conducted on the human biology, I don't even know if we can call it that anymore. We're in transhumanism, human 2.0. It's already happened. I'm on X. I've been looking at the papers. It's mind-blowing what's out there, and it's underground. You have to be in the circles. You have to follow the people that are digging up these papers, because the media is not talking about it, but sensors exist, which I am super excited about, because I do believe that we need to be able to test our blood for pollutants so we don't have to rely on the people like the EPA and the FDA to tell us what isn't safe in our food when they're really, really slow at doing that. And a bunch of people have to get really sick and die before we do anything and make those announcements. So I'm hoping that these sensors will be used for productive reasons. And this is also why I believe that we have been kept in the dark about what is possible with the human body, including cloning. And I just want to say that if I have a clone, I want to know about it, because it should be my right to recruit them to collectively join together and create our vision in the world. Are they completely independent? Do they look like me? Do you have a clone? How many clones are out there? Are we tracking them? Is somebody tracking them, but we don't get any information about this? That doesn't seem to be a very sovereign type of existence, if you know what I mean. That kind of speaks of suppression. And it doesn't have to be. There could be very legitimate reasons why we could have clones out there and we not be privy to this information. But in an ethical transhumanist world, I believe that we should be able to coordinate with our clones, and we should be able to create legacies and impacts on society that we are collectively, with our clones, proud of, and to redistribute tasks or purposes or missions that we don't feel called to execute in one particular lifeline, but they might want to execute in a different lifeline. And we should check in with each other. But with the way that things are going, with people just dropping dead, or patents and technologies going underground to be developed in secret compartments, black budgets, inaccessible to people like you and I, it's obviously, we have a reason for concern, right? Because who's running that show, and what are their intentions? And if it looks like we're all going down on a sinking ship, then shouldn't we have a conversation about it, even if it's a tough conversation?